In this last module of the course, we're going to talk about language. And language is one of the most fascinating cognitive abilities, and it's also the one that really sets us apart from other species. So as we go through a discussion of language, of course there's much to say about this, and you can in fact take entire courses on psycholinguistics, but for the purposes of this course we'll keep this relatively contained. So I'll quickly give you a little bit of historical background in how language was studied and the role of language and studying language within cognitive psychology. Then I'll say a little bit about the structure of language, language disruptions, what can go wrong in the brain and how that affects language. Then how language and thought are related to each other, including an example of bilingualism, when people know more than one language. And then a little bit about language comprehension. So I've already talked about reflex chaining when I talked about action planning. And just as William James thought that sequences of movements could just be sequences of reflexes, it was also thought by people like Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner that language was much the same, that words were basically stimuli to which the next word was a response, and then that yielded new sensory input to which there was then the next response, and that language is basically just a chain of reinforced patterns of sound that got reinforced over and over, and because of that we would learn words as language. Now, behaviorism had a legitimate attempt at accounting for language in terms of behaviorist principles, and actually B.F. Skinner, one of his more famous papers he wrote was called Verbal Behavior, and it was an attempt at accounting for language in terms of behaviorist principles, but it didn't really fully work out. And part of the reason why it didn't was because psycholinguists really started to object to the idea that behaviorism could fully account for the richness and the complexity of language. And one of the first people who really started providing an alternative view of language was a famous researcher by the name of Noam Chomsky, a psycholinguist at MIT, nowadays more known for his political activism, but back in the day became very famous for his theory on language. And what he said was that sentences are not just strings of words, which was in essence what behaviorism was suggesting. He pointed out that language has distinct structures behind it. So for example, if you have a sentence like "they are cooking apples," there's 4 words here, but depending on your inflection, it actually means something else. In one case, we could see cooking as the verb, and you would be saying that they are cooking apples. However, the exact same sequence of 4 words could also be interpreted as the are part being the verb, and then cooking being an adjective to the apples. So there are a particular type of apples, they are cooking apples. So they are cooking apples actually is not just a string of 4 words, but your interpretation of that depends on what structure you assume to be underlying that sentence. So at the highest level we have the sentence structure, then we have what Chomsky called the noun phrase, so that is the subject of the sentence, and then the verb phrase, which contains the verb as well as the object here. And in this case, the object is the apples and the cooking is the adjective that describes something about the apples. We can also see it as the sentence level. Noun phrase is still the same. The verb phrase instead has the verb of are cooking, and then the noun phrase is just the apples. So this suggests that there's actually much more structure behind language than behaviorism would predict. Now, if you look at the kinds of mistakes and the kinds of rules that people are following, you can see this at a very early age. So the kinds of speech errors that children make are suggestive that they have an underlying structure, a rule-governed approach to creating language. So when a young child says, "I'm feeling very lunchy right now, mommy," that's a perfectly reasonable attempt at trying to speak English, except lunchy does not happen to be a type of way in which you can actually use the word lunch right here. But for other words, putting a Y behind it can actually work just fine. So these kinds of speech errors suggest that there is some underlying rule structure that's activated. It's just activated in slightly an incorrect context. Chomsky proposed the following. He proposed that babies across the planet were born with what he called the language acquisition device. And what this means is that it's a universal device, all humans have it, and it's innate. People are born with it. And of course, it's easy to claim these kinds of things, but Chomsky provided a set of pieces of evidence for this that we'll evaluate in the next video.